Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes. We try to turn you on to great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, and also earth-shattering discoveries. Things that if you only knew about them, they would have a big impact on your life, but they have been marginalized because they have some type of revolutionary power against the powers that be. And this is our 177th Bible Decode, coming from the New Testament and exploring the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is that the New Testament was written by the Romans, not by the illiterate Jews in Palestine writing in Greek, but instead the Roman Caesars from the Flavian dynasty. The Flavian dynasty comprised of Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, that ruled Rome and the whole empire from 69 until 96 AD. And according to the theory, they wrote the Gospels and then they backdated them by 40 years or so, putting Jesus's ministry in the early 30s AD, or some might say the late 20s. But at the very same time, they wrote a history of the Jewish War, the war between the Romans and the Jews, that occurred from 66 until 73 AD. The first two Flavian emperors, Vespasian and Titus, are the protagonists in that 7-volume work called Jewish War, because Vespasian and Titus were the two leading military commanders. First it was Vespasian, but then in 69 AD he became the new emperor. And so he put the military in charge of his son Titus, who went on to lay Jerusalem to waste in 70 AD and finally defeat the Jews completely, culminating in a mass suicide of Jews at Masada in 73 AD. And that might have had something to do with Titus's motives, as he couldn't get the Jews to bow down to him. They preferred to commit suicide instead. They could not, give him any type of credit, or certainly not to think of him as a deity, which is what he thought of himself. But instead, they all killed themselves. I seriously doubt the truth of that story, but that is written in this story, Jewish War, which was written under the name of Josephus, or Flavius Josephus. I also don't believe in the existence of Flavius Josephus, but regardless, according to his autobiography, he was a family member by adoption of the Flavians. He started out as a Jewish military commander, but then surrendered to Vespasian, and in doing so recognized that God now favors the Romans, not the Jews, and so he defected to the Romans, gave Vespasian a prophecy that he would one day become the new Caesar. And when he did become the new Caesar, Vespasian pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome as one of the court historians, put him up in a townhouse at Caesar's palace where he lived the rest of his days, and adopted him into his family. So he is known as Flavius Josephus. Now, if you read Flavius Josephus alongside the New Testament, you will discover that they are written by the same entity. Whoever Josephus was also the person that wrote the New Testament, or at least the Gospels, the synoptic Gospels. I think that whoever Josephus was, his later family may have written some of the other material in the New Testament, like John and Acts. That may have been written by Domitian, and possibly Pliny the Younger would have been writing the Pauline epistles in, again, a later period, not an earlier period, which is what most scholars believe. The Pauline epistles were written quite a bit earlier than the Gospels, but only because Paul had ample opportunity to cite Jesus' words in the Gospels and did not do so. And that's really the only good evidence that they have to assume that Paul's writing is pre-Jewish war or pre-Gospels. Now, the main motive for the Romans to do this is that they wanted to mellow out or pacify or tame or domesticate the Jews. The Jews had been a royal pain in the butt for the Romans for the last 100+ years because of their separatist religion with their jealous and zealous God that also had OCD and a number of smoking addictions and had a very serious problem making decisions, resulting in, I believe the number is like 613 different rituals that the Jews were subjected to, along with strictures like strictures against graven images, circumcision, and all these kosher food laws and sanitary laws. They were willing to die to maintain their rituals. And the Romans were happy to oblige. They were happy to kill the Jews, who insisted upon, performing the rituals. But it was a major drain on the Roman resources to keep so many Jews, or keep so much attention on the Jews compared to all of the other different races, nations, and tribes that they had under their umbrella. The Jews just represented a very high maintenance, the highest maintenance of all the people in their empire. And Vespasian and Titus had both been wounded in the war, and I think they just had enough of the Jews, and they decided to go with the psychological operations to create, recognizing that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. But the Jews were waiting for a military Messiah, a military leader to come and help them throw off the yoke of the Romans, which they actually did in 66 AD, when Simon, John, and Eleazar did put together the people, command the military operation for the Jews to actually kick out the Herod kings, Agrippa, from Jerusalem and send them back to Rome. Problem was that it was all very short-lived, because that prompted Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian for the siege, to put down the revolts. But it took 7 years to put the whole thing down. So the Romans knew that this was way too high maintenance for what they were trying to really accomplish with the Jews. And so they attempted to instead write about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to walk an extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack, to believe that the uncircumcised Roman soldier slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and to turn the other cheek on oppression, and to exhort his God to forgive the Romans, while at the same time going outside the Temple of Jerusalem and overturning the tables of the money changers, who were trading out the Roman money with the graven images all over them for the sacred kosher Jewish money, so that the Jews could buy their small animals from the Jewish entrepreneurs that were also out there for the animal sacrifices inside the temple. And so Jesus is taking direct aim at the Jewish rituals, which he does throughout, and he is utterly, completely deferential to the Romans, which he is throughout. I believe there is not a single example of him having any ill will to the Romans. And Paul is even worse. So it is almost as if the Romans wrote the whole thing and orchestrated the whole thing as a psychological operation. And then when you throw in the other circumstantial evidence, like the New Testament's written in Greek, which is the language of Rome, not Judea. Now, the Roman royals tended toward both Greek and Latin. The common people mostly spoke Greek. And, the literacy rates were low, so most people didn't write. And incidentally, I believe that the Gospels were written really as plays to be performed in front of people to spread the message to the illiterates. But the Romans also had a monopoly on censorship, a monopoly on publishing, with their thousands of slave scribes that could sit around all day and copy texts over and over again, and a monopoly on distribution, having the only postal service in the empire. So the Romans were really the only people who even could have put out the Gospels, because they were the only people who could have put out anything. They were the only people who did put out anything. The only really major documents that were written in the first century were either written by Roman royalty, or perhaps the aliases of Roman royalty. And then there's the Gospels. And then there's the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were only discovered in the 1940s and 50s, but they are mostly written in Hebrew, and they contain really all but one, I think, maybe the Book of Esther, all the books of all the books of the Old Testament are included in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you wonder where these people got the money for all the publishing that they did at that Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea. But anyway, the main evidence for the Romans' authorship of the New Testament is the patterns that are involved. If you read War of the Jews alongside the Gospels, they are meant to go together. You can see the endless amount of patterns between the two, parallels between the two. Joseph Atwill found a string of about 40 to 45 separate events from Jesus' ministry, Jesus' 3-year ministry in Judea, and Titus's 3-year military campaign in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. And they go there in the same order. And when they go there, they encounter events that are parallel to each other. Jesus and Titus do not encounter the same events, but they encounter typologically similar events or analogous events. Moreover, the events are separated by exactly 40 years. And again, we're not talking about just a couple of events. We're talking about 40 of them. Joseph Atwill calls it the Flavian signature. Then Michael Menescotts, in his book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, uncovered even more parallels in the book of Luke. He looked for parallels between Josephus and the war and the book of Luke, and found over 250 of them. That's over 10 per chapter. That means that the book of Luke is entirely saturated with parallels from Josephus. And it's not just a one-way parallelism, it's mutual. They're going back and forth, a kind of a conversation in many places. And some of the parallels will absolutely knock your socks off with the level of sophistication, detail, intricateness, and well-hiddenness. And their utterly insulting and ridiculing nature. They are so mean-spirited that it can take your breath away. Now, some of the parallels are more trivial and offhanded and could be dismissed as coincidental if they were just standing alone. But the mere volume of the parallels makes even the simple, trivial parallels obviously intentional. Now, there may be, out of the 250, maybe there are a couple of them that are not even intentional. But the vast majority of them are intentional, and 10 or 20 of them are so strong that they would constitute a conclusive argument just by themselves. Now, not only that, but Michael Menescotts then graphs the parallels on a chart, puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every time he finds a correspondence, he plots a point at that spot. After plotting all 250 points, he has created 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, APTVS, the language of the Roman Caesars, and certainly the initials of Titus and Vespasian, among others. So the upshot is that not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they put their autograph on it, or they signed their initials to it. Now, what we're looking at today, for the 8th day in a row, I believe, is we're looking over a book of Christian apologetics called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And he was a court reporter who eventually found Christ, and he traveled around the country visiting many of the luminaries in the apologetics movement, I guess, scholars, and he tried to create the case, like a legal case, for Christ. And what And he made a whole enterprise out of it. Now he's written 30-some books, and they're all the case for this and the case for that, the case for the miracles, the case for, the resurrection, the case for the virgin birth. And they're all based on the same idea. And this is the book that you will get if you have a Christian friend who's trying to convert you. They will get you the case for Christ. Now, the ironic thing is that none of the people that are involved in this Case for Christ book know anything about the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, which has been around for a very long time, but made most popular by Joseph Atwill's 2005 book called Caesar's Messiah. But what is ironic is that when making the case for Christ, they actually make the case for Caesar even better. Many of the arguments that they use for the case for Christ actually make the case for Caesar if you knew about the Roman origins hypothesis. So we're about to start chapter 10 of this book. I guess he's interviewing this guy named Lapides, Lapides. And he says, in the Old Testament, there are more than 4 dozen major predictions in all that predict Jesus. Someone did the math and figured out that the probability of just 8 prophecies being fulfilled is 1 chance in 100 million billion. It's 10 to the 17th. So whoever did the math is basically saying that the probability of 1 prophecy becoming true is over 1 in 100. I wonder where they get that figure from, 1 in 100 for one of them, and then when you tack on 7 more, you get ultimately 10 to the 16. So it's even more than that, more than 1 in 100 for 1 prophecy to come true. That's it's way out of line. But anyway. Someone would have said to Matthew, so he's saying when the Gospels were being circulated, there were people living who had been around when all these things happened. Someone would have said to Matthew, it didn't happen that way. We're trying to communicate a life of righteousness and truth, so don't taint it with a lie. So this is a common refrain in this book that the people that wrote the Gospels were very honest and they were trying to tell the truth the best they could. But if you know that they were the Romans, then you recognize that it's complete propaganda. And they were not. And even if you don't recognize that it's the Romans, you need to recognize that all ancient writing, and modern, but especially ancient, they weren't nearly as concerned with the truth as people would be today. They didn't mind putting in a detail that made their case a little bit better, even if it wasn't true. The legendary stuff is always top of mind for these people. And you can see that in all of the pious fraud that occurred by the church fathers and other Christians in the few centuries after the first century. Jesus, the sole individual in history who has matched the prophetic fingerprint of God's anointed one. Well, unfortunately, this isn't true either, because if you read War of the Jews by Josephus, you will see, and you read the Gospels, you will see that I believe it's at least a dozen prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of War of the Jews, and they're mainly fulfilled by Titus. In particular, the destruction of Jerusalem, which Jesus predicts that will happen in his lifetime, and that it is because the Jews deserve it, because they wanted Jesus executed. And the person who fulfills the prophecy is General Titus. This makes General Titus the second coming of Jesus. And in ancient history, many, many, many Christians understood this. Josephus's War of the Jews was part of the biblical canon for many sects of Christians at that time. Okay, next chapter. The idea that Jesus never really died on the cross can be found in the Quran. And it says there that Jesus actually fled to India. And today there's a shrine that supposedly marks his real burial place. And obviously, Strobel has to use the term conspiracy theorists to suggest that this is outlandish ridiculousness. But he says conspiracy theorists bolstered this hypothesis by pointing out that Jesus had been given some liquid on a sponge while on the cross. It's in Mark 15:36. And that is actually a verse that I believe it's also in Luke. And this is absolutely devastating parallel when you break it down after reading Josephus. But this liquid on a sponge, the sponge is what you use to wipe your butt with. That's the actual term, the Greek term that's used for sponge is the same term that's used for the thing that you wipe your butt with back in the day. So anyway, now we're talking about resurrection expert Gary Habermas, who was also a member of the apologists that Strobel interviewed for this book. And he talks about sweating blood. Somewhere toward the end of Jesus's, before he gave up the ghost, he began to sweat blood. I think some of that might have had to do with being pierced in the ribs, but not sure. I think it might have actually happened before that. But now he's talking to an apologist who actually is a medical forensics expert, and his name is Metherell. Metherell shook his head. "Not at all," he replied. "This is a known medical condition called hematidrosis. It's not very common, but it is associated with a high degree of psychological stress. What happens is that severe anxiety causes the release of chemicals that break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. As a result, there's a small amount of bleeding into these glands, and the sweat comes out tinged with blood. We're not talking about a lot of blood. It's just a very, very small amount." So, in other words, the Gospels were correct to say that he was sweating blood because there is a medical condition that he says it's just a very, very small amount of blood. I'm not even saying that this is wrong. I'm just saying that if this is what you're using for evidence, you have to recognize that you really don't have any evidence. This is really, that's desperation, that's grasping at straws. Just to even put that point in the book, because it's so minor. Now he's talking about the crossbar of the cross, the patibulum. Both shoulders would have become dislocated. Now, I've heard sources that would tell you otherwise. The Romans, when they crucified you, from what I understand, they didn't just nail your hands into the cross or even to tie your hands onto the patibulum, but they would also kind of harness you up there by your torso. And so it didn't. He says, first of all, his arms would have immediately been stretched, probably about 6 inches in length, and both shoulders would have become dislocated. That's totally not my understanding. I understand that crucifixion was a very, very, very long process that could sometimes take even over a week to kill somebody. When they wanted to kill you faster, they broke your legs, and that would bring on that dislocation of the shoulders, because they kind of had your torso, or at least your legs, kind of propped up, so that the pressure wasn't so, the weight wasn't so just on your arms. It was distributed. Okay, Psalm 22, which foretold the crucifixion hundreds of years before it took place, and says, "My bones are out of joint." Again, that's just such a weak source of evidence. I mean, he's assuming that his shoulders became dislocated, and then he's using "my bones are out of joint" from Psalm 22 to prove it. I'd have to look at Psalm 22 to see exactly what it's talking about, and perhaps I will do that. Here's another "he would have" comment, which I understand we don't really have any evidence, so we have to speculate a little bit. But he says, "He would have looked so pitiful that the disciples would never have hailed him as a victorious conqueror of death." They must not have believed him too much then. It's preposterous to think that if he had appeared to them in that awful state, his followers would have been prompted to start a worldwide movement. So I guess he's arguing that he would have never appeared in such a state. Okay.